Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the museum. I hope you've been able to see the exhibition either last night or today. I'm William Andrews, the Hellis Foundation Executive Director of Ogden Museum of Southern Art. Very happy to welcome you today here on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of Ogden Museum. Before we get to our program, there are many special things to have, in particular for the presentation today, a distinction that our program is brought to us all by the Shirley Rebatta Center Fund here at Ogden Museum, which supports both education, acquisition, and other artistic endeavors at the museum. So representing that fund today is Eve Messiner, the artist's daughter, and Monica Froys. Thank you so much both for choosing to present today's program. It's a new fund at the museum, and we're absolutely thrilled to be enjoying it. So I'm happy to introduce and turn the program over to Curator of Photography, Richard McCabe, whose work you've seen on the walls in organizing the exhibition of Baldwin Lee, along with our curatorial staff, Amy Newell, Bradley Summerall, and Selena McCain. So thank you very much. Richard?
Thank you, William. Thanks, y'all, for coming out to this curated conversation around the Baldwin Lee exhibition here at the Ogden that opened today. And it'll go on through the end of February. I know it's on through the Super Bowl because Baldwin wants to be able to sit in the box with Taylor Swift. So I don't know the exact dates, but we'll let you know later. I'm going to introduce the panelists here. We're really excited about this curated conversation. Andrew Rebatta is the Director of Curatorial Affairs for Prospect New Orleans. Andrew has organized exhibitions, performances, screenings, and talks for museums and contemporary art spaces in the US, Canada, and Mexico. Andrew spent his formative postgraduate years throwing art shows and playing records in Chicago and DC before returning to his hometown of New York City, where he was most recently the Associate Curator at the Museum of Chinese in America. Andrew's recent research has been delving in the diasporic relations that have influenced his curatorial practice of interpreting the poetics of immigrant material culture, particularly through audio recordings. Baldwin Lee is a photographer and educator known for his photographs of Black communities in the American South. Lee, a first-generation Chinese American, received a bachelor's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1972, where he studied with the great Minor White. He went on to receive a Master's of Fine Arts from Yale University in 1975, where he studied with Walker Evans. After college, Lee began teaching photography at the Massachusetts College of Art and Yale University, while at the same time making photographs that explored the contemporary built environment. In 1982, Lee became the professor of art at the University of Tennessee, where he founded the university's photography program. Lee is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1984 and a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in 1984 and 1990. He has had solo exhibitions at the Chrysler Museum of Art, Museum of Contemporary Art, Georgia, Howard Greenberg Gallery, New York, Joseph Bellows Gallery, La Jolla, California, and David Hill Gallery in London, England. His work is held in many private and public collections, including the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, the Museum of Modern Art, Yale University Art Gallery, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., the Morgan Library, and the Museum of the City of New York. Also, the Do Good Fund, Inc. in Columbus, Georgia. In 2022, Hunters Point Press published Baldwin Lee, a monograph of the photographer's 1980 Southern photographs. After the talk, Baldwin will be available to sign copies. I think we only have about 10 left in the museum store. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel now. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm a little bit of a low talker, so if you can't hear me, just go motion this way to get me to speak up. Today, thank you so much to the Ogden, William, Richard, Amy, everyone on the curatorial staff for this invitation. And thank you, Baldwin, for just being open to riffing with me this afternoon after your opening, and it's amazing show. So congrats, Richard, and congrats, Baldwin. Just a beautiful presentation downstairs. Today's talk, I think it's going to be a combination of like part oral history and part reflection on Baldwin's photography practice and the photographic medium itself. Behind me, there will be slides just playing, it'll be continuously playing of different photographs that are included in the exhibition below. But as the young people say, I'm just trying to create a vibe with them. I'm mostly here to kind of discuss with Baldwin just a lot of the gaps and other, topics that maybe don't always get brought forth during interviews and conversations and in some of the writing about Baldwin. I also want to just give a disclaimer that, I'm not a photography geek. I am not a photographer, but I have worked a lot with photography, particularly vernacular photography, in community archives, in community-based museums. And so that's where my interest in Baldwin's work really lies, beyond just the sheer beauty and craft that he sort of projects in them. At some point, we will be reaching a Q&A. We'll see when that begins, but during that Q&A, folks out there should feel free to point to an image or bring one up so that we can all view it as a group and listen to your question. And with that, I'd love to just maybe ease into this conversation with very basic questions, Baldwin. When were you born? Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in 1951 in Brooklyn, and I grew up in New York's Chinatown.
And how did your family end up in Brooklyn? What was their immigration story at that time?
My mother and father were married in China just before World War II, and my father came to the U.S. to study architecture at Pratt, although he never got a chance to practice. And he brought my mother over to the United States as a GI bride. My father had the honor of being a soldier on D-Day. And so the War Museum here and everything, it's something that has a deeper meaning for me and my family members.
And where in China was your family living before they came?
Around Hong Kong.
Around Hong Kong. Okay, all right. So it makes total sense when you arrived, where you arrived, and just living in Chinatown. And something about Chinatown, I don't know if everybody in this audience is familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, how that act was repealed after World War II, but how it wasn't completely true in terms of exclusion. There were still Chinese immigrating here during that time period, but there were often merchants, students, there were connections between the US government, universities, and China, so there was a pathway. So your family, your father being able to arrive here was kind of a rare thing at the time.
Yes, it was, but there were precedents. His grandfather came to New York and started a business in New York, and so the rest of us coming was a pretty natural thing.
And growing up in Chinatown, it's always been my understanding, and I didn't get to experience it myself, that even though immigration opened up, with the repeal of the act in 1942, and Chinese were continuing to arrive through a quota system, was Chinatown? My understanding was it was kind of like a bachelor society still, even though there were families reunification and there were families forming. But do you have memories of that time period and just what public life was like?
Well, Chinatown in Manhattan was really a self-contained enclave. The schools were there, the businesses were there, people's social life revolved and was contained in Chinatown.
And just to kind of connect to your practice, Chinatown itself did have, or does have, its own sort of like history of photography, right? Like I believe when you were younger, before you left for college, Emile Beauchesne was photographing like the streetscapes and photographing people and events. Maybe, and I don't know if you knew Corky Lee at all, but Corky was another one, but he was doing it more from like an insider perspective, more about documenting aspects of life that many wouldn't really think about or consider.
Yeah, that's very true, yes.
Yeah. And did you know Corky?
No, I never did. I knew what he was doing, but I never had the opportunity to meet with him.
Oh, wow, no, so we'll talk afterwards. I'd love to just hear more about your thoughts about his work. But you know, I feel like your career trajectory, you leaving Chinatown. I've heard in a number of interviews that you've participated in that. You know, that's when like your education started. But you know, clearly you were a valedictorian at Brooklyn Tech. You went to MIT, eventually Yale. But can you tell us more about what that education like was and how it sort of informed your photography practice at the time or your interest in photography?
My educational background actually existed with two independent tracks. One was academic, where you studied your subjects, but the other one was to be introduced into the dominant culture. And so learning about white culture and white people. I had no idea that there were many distinctions in the white population. I thought people who were white were all part of a homogenous sort of a group, but then I learned that there were religious differences, economic differences, across the board. So that was really a very important part of my education, and from my appreciation of knowing about these more subtle but crucial distinctions, that's what allowed me to do my work with Black Americans.
And I'm just being very like presumptuous here. When going to Cambridge and then eventually going to New Haven and learning about the diversity of our white population here, especially and with its specific sort of like way of being in the Northeast, let's say, a New England sort of identity. What was that like? How did you settle in when you got to Cambridge? And then eventually, how did you kind of settle into New Haven and taking up like a MFA in photography?
I always felt to be an outsider. I didn't belong. Those who were on the inside had been there for many generations. And so even today, I don't really feel as if I've totally integrated into that world.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say that also because, as an Asian American, I'm also mixed race. I always see myself as sort of in between, and I feel like as an Asian American, we're often thought of that. Even with like the model minority myth existing as like a wedge of sorts. But in a lot of ways, Asian American presence here were like bridges, depending on our geography in this country. And so, knowing that there was already a sort of burgeoning Asian Chinese population in the South in certain places like Memphis or Mississippi, like Clarksdale, where Gilroy and Sally Chow live, and how a lot of these merchants were sort of creating these spaces that can like transgress a lot of these divisions that were very prominent at the time in the South. Like, how do you like perceive yourself as being sort of in between? Like once you arrived in the South, how did you sort of, you're partly outsider, partly something else, or how did you kind of like understand your own positionality there?
It's kind of like what Trump said. You know, I'm coming out now as an Asian, and I'm allowing it to just surface and. What, Maureen? Oh, my wife thought she married a white guy. She heard the name Baldwin Lee and thought, you know, it's this waspy white guy. Too late. Just too late.
And so just in recent years, you know, I think like you know, I'm definitely just skipping ahead here in my own like sort of thought process. But for when COVID happened, I felt like there was like an awakening with a lot of Asians in America, and this term Asian American, this identity with all of its sort of inequities and insufficiencies, but an important sort of political identity in a lot of ways for mobilizing. Was that like a moment that you took pause and, you know, like everybody else was taking pause in America and kind of were reflecting more on it, or did it change during that period?
I mean, definitely. I mean, you know, to have people calling it the Asian flu and all that stuff, and you know, and pointing to Wuhan as being the culprit in all this stuff. But, you know, it's all come around so that, you know, during the COVID crisis, you know, the blame was in part placed on the pangolin. Do you know what a pangolin is? It's a really cool half reptile, half mammal animal, and I would love to have one as a pet. And, you know, and so, you know, it's been able to like be superseded by the pygmy hippo Mo Dang, who's my current favorite. So these little cute Asian animals have eased the sort of blame, and so the only thing that's left now is all the cheap Chinese shit that Amazon is like throwing out there into the market. My wife says I shouldn't swear. Everybody's
refreshing.
Everybody's heard that word before.
And you know, just before this, just before we came up here, I was chatting with your sister about, you know, coming in from New York and talking a little bit about my time in New York and just how things have been changing. But something from like the sort of, and I'm not going to dwell too long on COVID, folks, because we should just move past that as well. But you know, it's this term anti-Asian hate was really talked a lot about, and I think one of it was like a moment where, like, you know, we were kind of being used not just as like an object for people to rally around their frustrations and focus their frustrations on, but again, like a wedge, even within our own communities, you know, like if you were an Asian Twitter back then, you could see like there was very much this narrative of African American, other immigrant groups inflicting violence on Chinese or Asian people in a lot of the major metropolitan areas in the U.S. But it's a completely false narrative. But it was something that was being perpetuated a lot. Just thinking about that and thinking about the importance of your show and the relevance of it today, does that make you think about your work differently? Does it make you sort of reflect on it, even after me just saying this, like, in terms of like its value to you, and maybe even like, you know, those you're trying to reach through your work?
For individuals who are interested in division, the easiest way to do so is to point out the differences and distinctions of individual groups, and then it naturally follows that they can then drive wedges in between them, and cause confusion about what the real issues should be. And so, unfortunately, we've been victim of that kind of thinking and policy.
Yeah, no, yeah, I very much agree with that. And yeah, I don't know, like for me, it's like, if you were to come across your work, just the images itself, the way that images kind of circulate these days in the digital realm, they're just out there. They're often decontextualized. Formally, there's just so much you can see about you trying to capture and express when they're like portraits or still lifes, someone's identity, their dreams, their destinies, their histories. All these different elements I see in the work, especially the interior, domestic sort of photos we see, these traces of change, how people use the things and objects that are around them. I just feel like very emotionally sort of connected to the work in that sense. But I kind of wanted to get back to your interest in architecture. You're capturing the landscapes, these portraits, these still lifes, and how they operate as almost like a theatrical backdrop. And so, just to focus a little bit more on your process, what was it like, the first photo that you took, that you consider maybe the first photo in this body of work? What was that like? What was that feeling? And what was the sort of mindset at the time when you were doing it?
It's a mistaken but commonly assumed thing that artists start out knowing what it is that they want to do. That you have a subject already that's been predetermined. I don't believe that's exactly accurate. I think an artist is involved in a process of searching for a subject, and that is done so through his or her medium of choice, but it's really a much more internal, self-reflective kind of thing. You have to ask yourself, what's really important to me, and you hope that in this exploration that you'll eventually find out what that may be. And so I discovered my subject rather than selecting my subject.
And at what point did you feel like you needed to, or you felt compelled to continue with this subject matter? I mean, we're looking at 1983 to roughly 1990, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and over time, like, were relationships built? I know that there's we can get back to your history with Walker Evans as well. I know part of this journey was retracing some of his photographs and places he's been, but what sort of throughout that process, what gives shape to those memories? What gives shape to your practice at the time, or what led it to what it became?
Oh, that process is a two-way street. However it is that you're interacting with what's in front of you influences, what you want that photograph to do or to be about. But the other half of it is like what it is that you have already thought before arriving at the scene. So it was a personal event of significance was the birth of my children. And my son Timothy was born, and my mother made a big fuss of becoming a grandmother, and she wanted to buy a baby furniture, and we lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, where there's a ample supply of really beautiful antiques. And so we wanted to perhaps buy antique baby furniture, but subsequent investigation led us to learn that OSHA has standards about the width between the slats and the side of the crib, and I believe it's like 2 3/8 inches. It's very specific, and so that precluded buying antique furniture. And so at this time, I was in Augusta, Georgia, making a photograph, and this is like what I'm about to describe is essentially is what I did in every one of my pictures, and that is, I was walking down a street in Augusta, Georgia, in a rundown part of town, and I carried my camera on my shoulder on its tripod, and so I looked, I was that day's entertainment, this person with this antique camera, and you notice on the street, things happening, and this is in part because I grew up in New York, and you were taught to be suspicious and observant, and so a van passed by me, and then a few minutes later it passed by me again. I go, hey, what's going on? And the second time it passed by me, it slowed and it stopped, and the window rolled down, and this person leaned out the window and said to me, "Are you a photographer?" And I go, I'm kind of, I go, yeah. And this person asked me, "Would you come with us to take a picture?" And I said yes. So I got into this van, and we drove for about 15 minutes, and they pulled up to a funeral home. And what had happened was their baby was laid out in an open casket, and they asked me to take some pictures of the baby and then of the mother and the baby. And afterwards, I was invited over to their home for iced tea. And I was sitting there sipping the tea, and I was opposite this doorway that led into another room, a bedroom. And that's when the baby's parents told me that the death of the baby occurred because they did not have a crib, and the baby was tossing and turning on their parents' bed and got caught in the sheets, rolled off the edge of the bed, and suffocated. And so I knew from that moment on that there are really very personal stories about events that are momentous. And so that gave me a lot of impetus to continue making these pictures.
And, just out of curiosity, Baldwin, so have any of these families or individuals you photographed, do they receive photos afterwards? And now that your work is sort of circulating again in a very expansive way, has anyone ever tried reaching out? I'm in that photo, or that's my relative.
Maybe it was half a year ago, I received an email from this woman, and it began, "Dear Mr. Lee, if you're still alive," which is a very fair question. If you're still alive, I'm grown up now, but I'm the little baby that you took a picture of me in Plain Dealing, Louisiana. And it, in fact, is one of my all-time favorite pictures. And Plain Dealing, Louisiana is in a corner, northwest corner of the state. It's called the Arklatex. And it was a picture of her in her mother's lap and it was incredibly hot, and she looked like she had melted into her mother's knees. And so that picture shows how beautiful the texture of a baby's skin is. And so when she contacted me, we chatted on the phone for a while, and she told me that she left home, she moved to Houston, where she's become a nurse, and she helps to run a community art gallery. And so I got the address of the gallery, and I sent her a dozen roses, to thank her. But yeah, it's like, these brief exchanges that you have with people, they have lasting repercussions. On another occasion, I met with a woman I had photographed previously. And my practice was to, on a given trip, spend half my time exploring new places and the other half revisiting places that I had been to before in hopes of running into people I'd photographed. So this was the case with this woman, and she saw me, and she rushed into her house and came out with the photograph I had sent back of her. And she ripped it up in front of me, and she said, "I hated this picture you took of me." Yeah, so sometimes, it breaks your way, and sometimes it doesn't. So what are you going to do? Everybody's a critic, right? I mean, she's probably, the critic for, whatever, Houston Chronicle Arts and Leisure section.
Wow, Baldwin, thanks for sharing those stories. Oh my God, yes. I just love how you showed us both sides of that sort of operation there. And I think I'd love to maybe just discuss, before we open it up to the audience for Q&A, just the difference between portraits and the still lifes with individuals in them and your landscapes. I know you were driving around most, with your base being in Tennessee. You're driving around basically the Mississippi Delta. Part of me is thinking of music within this context. The independence of having a car, having grown up in Chinatown where, very few people own them. The freedom that you must have felt, the accessibility to music and the airwaves, being in maybe one of the most influential areas of music creation in the world at the time, but also driving around when your hometown was producing, again, what is maybe one of the most elevated and maybe longest lasting of African American cultural forms of hip hop, which I see the sort of styles and fashions in some of the photos you've been taking as well. But really, that's just a long way of me asking, what were you listening to? And for these landscapes, when I think of music, I think of time being structured. And these landscapes almost feel that way to me. These in-between moments, these where, presence means something different. It's more about your presence. It's more about maybe silence or stillness. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your landscapes?
Yeah, when you're driving around, you back then it was just a radio. I mean, you didn't have all this stuff that you could go onto the internet for, and so I loved AM radio, and I loved scanning the dial for local stations, and half the local stations were Bible thumpers, and they're preaching, and they were really adamant about what their message was. And the other half were radio stations that just played whatever music, they happened to have. And so when you're going through the Delta, of course you're going to hear the blues, and so you know. You have Memphis at one end and Clarksdale, Mississippi, the other end, and so you could never get away from the origin of the blues. And I would make it a point to see if I could find the birthplaces of musicians, and so I was able to like take a picture of the home where B.B. King was born, and so it's just an important part of culture.
Yeah, I don't know, like something that the slideshow playing behind me was just me kind of quickly selecting images from the exhibition checklist. Just one pass, sent it to Richard. Just let's have these going, and I just wanted like to almost like a short list that I can kind of like reflect on a little bit, just like meditate with. And something that really emerged to me is as in terms of like a thematic, like which I feel like may not be intentional, but is this concept of like mourning, through the you capturing like these ruins, looking at a dispossessed landscape, mourning technological obsolescence in some ways, or mourning the sort of disposability of culture and the disposability of things that surround us. There's one photo where I saw a television turned up on its side and used as like a nightstand, basically. I don't know if like how conscious you were of it at the time, or what that sort of scene set, or how you think of it differently today when you revisit your work. But is there a sense of mourning to both the things that you experienced in time, but also a sense of mourning for this sort of analog photographic medium that is still present, but maybe not as practiced today?
There's a big difference between what it is that you think about after something's been made as opposed to during the making of it. And it has to do with the distinction between sentiment and sentimentality. Sentimentality is the death of anything good. I mean, it just gets sloppy and it overlooks what's really the substantial content of what's in front of you. I mean, sentiment is essential because in the end, whatever you do has to be about something. And sentiment, the two poles of it, at one end is in the realm of intellectual concerns, of ideas, and the other pole is, of course, about feelings. And so that's where you have to navigate what you want your work to be about. I mean, you have to be dispassionate to indulge in passion.
No, thank you for making that distinction as well. It's often nostalgia, right?
Nostalgia is not what it used to be.
Yeah. Unpack that a little bit for us, Baldwin. Baldwin, where's that coming from?
I can't help it. I just can't help it.
I know it's. I feel like I'm maybe from that generation, and that's where like sort of hip hop plays into it, where like nostalgia is kind of like a playground of sorts, but it's also a way to it's an entry point to learning about the past as well, and often gets de-romanticized once you like learn enough about, whatever subject matter that is that you're searching for. But I was, maybe to lead us to a bit of nostalgia, so 1983 to 1990, what else was going on in your life at that time? I know you started a family at some point, your family's here. Outside of this sort of project that you had undertaken, what else is going on in your life?
Well, it's the same thing that was going on in your lives. I mean, you're just dealing with everyday stuff, right? I mean, you're trying to make a living and dealing with, minor kind of things or personal tragedy. But I have to make sure that I say this, and that is that what you do is not who you are. I was never a photographer, although I devoted a lot of time and energy to it. I am somebody else. I exist independent of what I do, and so if you're able to subscribe to that kind of thinking, it's very freeing. I don't owe photography anything. It's not my master. I have to think about what's important to me and how I can further those particular concerns. None of us is what we do. I mean, professions lay claim to us, but it is an unfair claim.
No, it's really refreshing to hear you say that. Somebody as esteemed as you are, somebody whose work is like you said. I asked you how often you're doing these interviews. You're like the requests have mushroomed very recently. But it also, just to bring it back, and this will be my last question before we open it up to the audience, is what does it mean for you to be here right now in New Orleans, having your work exhibited at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art? Thinking like with all of your life experiences, having like multiple generations of Lee here right now, what does it mean for you right now to have your work taken in by not just like a newer audience, but also just a very like diverse and mixed audience where the world has like kind of changed so much since you ended this project?
I'm 73 years old, and I look at what's happened to me, and it's been largely by luck. I mean, I took a bunch of pictures, and so did a zillion other people, and I was lucky that people thought that what I was doing was interesting. When they put me in the ground, I don't want to have a granite Deerdorf as my headstone. We're all about other things that are more important.
Thank you, Baldwin.
Sure.
All right. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, this conversation has hinted at this, but Baldwin, I was wondering if you could talk more about how your being Asian American has contributed to your photography of African Americans.
Yeah, it's a very good question. If you're, if you belong to a marginalized community, you have sympathy for other marginalized communities, and you understand on a very basic level what their struggles are, and so you want to make sure that you deal with them with the respect that's required. Yeah.
To what extent are your photographs taken the instant it happened, as opposed to maybe staging, moving things around, asking someone a little more direction from you?
My photographs are half and half. They're half found and half choreographed. With an old-fashioned camera on a tripod, there's no such thing as sneak photography. I always have to ask for permission, and as soon as you ask for permission, the people you want to photograph naturally get kind of nervous, and they ask you what you want them to do. And so that dynamic is a very useful one, because they're not professional actors, and I'm not a professional director. So I'll ask people to do certain things, full well knowing they will not be able to replicate what I want. And hopefully, and oftentimes, what happens is they do something better than what I wanted. And so it turns out to be, the picture turns out to be as much of a surprise to me as anybody else. So that's what I really like about working in a deliberate, slow way.
I have a friend who grew up in the Mississippi Delta, and around the same period you were taking photographs. She was also taking photographs, around the people and places, and falling down buildings of the Delta. And because she was from the Delta, she knew the culture. Her license plate had a Delta license, county, and so she was wondering how you were received by the people that you asked to be, you asked if you could photograph her.
You remember when Sally Field won the Oscar and she was up at the stage and said, "They like me. They really like me. People like me." I don't really know what it is. Maybe it's the soap I use or something, but they find me very likable. When I approach groups of people to get permission to photograph, 19 out of 20 will say yes. I'm almost never turned down. And I think that being a different minority helps, because there's no pre-existing stereotype about me. If I were white, if you're live in a black community, the only white people you see regularly are A, drug dealers, B, members of the law, they're serving papers or looking to arrest somebody, and C, they're insurance salesmen. And so you don't want to see white people. Whereas when I begin to speak, oftentimes people are surprised that I speak good English, although it's my second language.
Two quick questions.
Yes.
One, are you still teaching at University of Tennessee?
No, I've stopped.
And two, this is a lot of very early work, obviously influenced by Walker Evans. I've heard you talk about Walker Evans before. Have you, and I gotta admit, I haven't seen any more recent work. Has your recent work sort of moved in different ways from your earlier work?
Yeah, it has, because it stopped. There is no more recent work, and I just really thought that by 1990 I had done my best work, and I don't want to do what some people do, and that is they continue work past their prime, and they make a mockery of themselves, and they wind up demeaning the medium that gave them their lives. So I don't want to do that. So I quit cold turkey.
Hope this doesn't feedback. Is it working? Oh, hi. Hello. I'm going to slide over here so it doesn't feedback. So I wanted to ask the question from the context of my experience. I'm a Black and Filipina artist, born in Japan but raised in the rural South. And so I'm sitting with like a lot of dissonance in this moment where, you know, I see myself and people that look like my family celebrated and as artists, but the audience is majority white, from what I can perceive. I could be wrong. And so my question is, what is the photographer's, or what do you believe the photographer's responsibility is around consent? And how does that inform where your work is shown, and do you even get a choice on where it's shown and who has access to it?
You know, there is no more precisely descriptive medium of documentation than photography. I mean, it shows in minute detail just exactly what was in front of the camera. But in so doing, it accomplishes something else. It shows you that we share much, much more in common than we thought. As different as we may be on the outside, we're really just the same person on the inside. So that's why I think it's like a really important endeavor to continue.
Well, it was a pleasure meeting you last night, even if you did go to a rival high school in New York. I thoroughly enjoyed the show last night. I was thinking about the photos that I responded to the most, namely two that were in the slideshow, the lady with the wigs that she was selling at the flea market and the lady in Monroe in the nightclub. And I was thinking that those seemed very engaging. The lady in the nightclub, it's almost performative, as opposed to many of the others. And there was one that was just up with young men, but also men and women, having a very almost Mona Lisa look on their face. And I'm not sure what you sensed was going on. Were they like, okay, just take the photo and be done with it? What was the engagement? I know you asked for permission, but I consent to take the photos, but I can't quite tell what it is that they are conveying to you, or the sense you got that they were conveying to you in the photos.
When I was making those pictures, the most important skill that I deployed was the same skill that a talent scout has in Hollywood. I'm looking for somebody who is a star, who has a bearing, a countenance, a posture that projects the fact that they're more important than anybody else. And so when I find somebody like that, it becomes a challenge to make a photograph that will show that star quality. It's like when you go to a live performance. I mean, you know without looking at the program who the star is. I mean, you don't need to have the spotlight. You know who, and you know who the supporting cast is. And so that's what it is that you want to make sure that you do. Give the star his or her due.
Hi, Mr. Lee. A technical question for you. You've mentioned using an antique camera.
Yes.
I'm a lay person. I don't really know camera equipment. Can you explain what type of camera it was and why you chose to use it? One of the things that we were commenting on was the beautiful sharpness of the photographs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, the camera type uses a much larger film size than a camera you would wear on a strap around your neck. And that allows for the image to be much more detailed. But more important than that, the kind of camera that I used had a bellows that attached in the front to a lens and to the back the film plane. And it allowed adjustments that you can't make with other kinds of cameras. In all other kind of cameras, the axis of the lens is exactly perpendicular to the film plane, and it points exactly to the middle of the film plane. But in a bellows camera, you can change the geometry and change the drawing of the image. And so when I would approach a subject, I would begin to make adjustments to my tripod legs before even setting up the camera. The height of the camera is the most important thing. And the worst height of the camera is eye level. That's what you see all the time. And it's also the most boring place from which to see. So after adjusting the height of the point of view, using the bellows movements to subtly affect a drawing, you can really tailor make the picture to show the subject the way that you want. Yes. Yes. I think that was natural light. I don't believe that there was anything that I added. Yeah, I mean, when I did add natural light, I used an old-fashioned flash bulb. Like back in the old-time movie days, that would just pop, and you could only use it once. You'd have to throw it out. Oh, no, that one, yeah, there were several from Columbia, but this one is with the flash, and you can see from the shadow that I have the flash. If my camera's here, the flash is out there.
I have a question. Oh, I have them. It's back here. So, as a survivor of going to school in Massachusetts and Connecticut, I totally understand where you're coming from, being Asian in those spaces. But I guess my question is that, with you going to all of these openings and everyone is like taking pictures of you and you stop cold turkey taking pictures of other people, how do you feel being in front of the camera after sort of like understanding the complexities of being behind the camera? And what's your go-to pose?
I think the end of photography occurred when the word selfie, became dominant. I mean, we're infinitely fascinated by images of ourselves. I mean, so that's going to be the dominant subject matter forever. And I chose this seat here because this is my better side. No, it's like it's made everybody so damn self-conscious. It's like, I mean, don't you hate it when you see a group of people posing for selfies out on the street? Don't you want to go and slap them or something?
Aside from the one you've already mentioned where the woman or the person tore up the photograph you showed them, have you contacted any of these people later?
It's they who would contact me, but because of how I worked, I would return to places I'd photographed. That's when I would get feedback. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, when you're a photographer, you're intervening on somebody else's lives, in somebody else's life. And in Valdosta, Georgia, I drove into town and I saw this man dumpster diving behind the local supermarket. And I drove a little bit further, I parked my car, and then some minutes later, I saw the same man sitting in a metal chair on his porch. I began to talk to him, and he then asked me to come inside to look at something. So I walked into his living room, and he opened up the drawer and pulled out a stack of envelopes about that thick. And I looked at the envelopes, and they were all official mail. There were some from the U.S. Army, some from insurance companies. These were all, letters that, this was not a stack of junk mail. And it became clear to me that he was illiterate. And although he lived across the street from a church, he didn't even trust the pastor with the letters. And so I opened up a few, and it turned out that he had quite a great deal of money coming to him. His son had died while serving in the Army, and had insurance benefits and stuff like that. So he was living in, he's dumpster diving, and he had this money coming to him. And so I asked him if he knew what this was, and he said sort of. And I asked him if he had a bank account. He said no. So I said, can I take you downtown to open up a bank account? And so I did. And we opened up the account, and he signed with an X. And so then I returned home to Tennessee with Social Security information and stuff like that. And so I got him right with all the governmental agencies so that he would get what was deserved. And the next time I went through Valdosta, I drove specifically to see him. And that's when I got a real dousing of cold water. This is when you realize how liberal fantasies are just fallacious. This man who got this money just used it to buy gin. And he was in the same chair I saw him in before, and he was shirtless, and he was covered in vomit from his chest all the way down to his lap. And so I stood there just shocked, and a young man came up to me and he said, "Why are you looking at him?" And I go, "I'm just looking." And the young man said to me, "Oh, I know. You're the one who got him his money." And then he said to me, "You're the one who's going to kill him." So it's like, it's like, yeah, I'm all for fighting poverty, but it's a more nuanced process than that. You don't just throw money at it and solve it. Yes.
Oh.
Yes, the question is about, my taking the pictures and processing them in a darkroom. Yeah, I always enjoyed the whole business about working with cameras and going into the darkroom. So the film I shot were sheets of film, 4 by 5 inches, and I would develop them in open trays in the dark, and then I would pick out ones that I would want to make prints from and put them into a big enlarger and project them onto 16 by 20 inch paper. And so I estimated that I took more than 10,000 pictures during this period, and so only a very small number of them have ever seen the light of day.
Mr. Lee, you study with Walker Evans and work with Walker Evans and
Yes.
Minor White. Could you share, say, one of the most important things that you learned from each with us?
Oh, yes. I learned that neither one liked each other. I mean, these are the two giants of American photography. And so Walker Evans considered Minor White to be this artsy-fartsy, self-inflated guy. And then Minor White thought that Walker Evans was nothing more than a documentary newspaper photographer. So, yeah, so that's what I learned.
Hi, I was wondering over the course of roughly 10,000 images, if there were moments where you went out to photograph and maybe you were surprised by something you saw and you happened to be with friends or family, or if it was always a solo experience.
The trips I took were not really fun. They're very hard. The heat of the summer and the kind of dangerous places I would go into, they were not meant for a family or passengers. So it was an entirely solo process.
So you talked a lot about feeling like a stranger in American culture, and I was wondering, while you were taking photos in these communities, did you ever feel like maybe you had a sense of community with the people you were taking pictures of, or did you always feel like the other, like kind of the witness always?
What an artist chooses to be his or her subject is based on things that they personally believe in and feel about. And so I didn't think that there was anything more important to stand in front of and to witness than the people in the communities that I photographed. I mean, it didn't require any kind of second guessing or second thoughts. I just knew it. And, it's like you were standing in front of history. You knew that what you were seeing was something that had existed for 100 years or more ago. And you had the horrible premonition that it was going to exist for another 100 years. That this is a perpetual, permanent situation. And it's something that the larger culture should be ashamed of.
Hello. As a photographer myself, who's Asian American, who does similar work in the community where I'm from, I do get a sense sometimes that, the question of who can tell each other's stories. And I think as a photographer, the way I think about it is I'm just there as a witness, like you said. And as long as my intentions are pure, I'm not there to exploit anyone. I'm just there to see myself in others. I think it's all about the connection that I've been making with my subjects that keep me going. And I think what you were asking earlier about like who can tell each other's stories. I think as long as your intentions are true, it doesn't matter if you're Asian American telling black stories or a white person telling Asian stories. For so long, it's been the white gaze has been prominent in the community. I mean, in the image making, in photography in general. So it's kind of refreshing to see your vision and the way you saw this community. So that's why I've been following your work and have been a big fan, a big influence.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, what you're talking about is really important because you can also do work that illustrates a preconceived notion. You already have an idea, so you're looking for a picture that fits it, and that's a real base way to use the medium. If you have respect for what you're photographing, you allow it to dictate where it goes. And then it's no longer your job to know what different people will look at and see in it, because their points of view are always valid, you know, and where your hopes and wishes were has to take a second place to that. Yeah, you're right.
All right.
I'll just say, going off that, do you feel that your work has influenced the society, or can art continue to influence society, considering that you had stopped it? Sorry, that was...
Can you repeat your question, please?
Just going off of what you said, you know, bearing witness, and then the work, you know, is interpreted how it's interpreted. Do you still feel that your work was, I guess, interpreted by society, or how was it interpreted by society when you first showed it in the 90s versus today? Does that not make sense?
I think we can never forget that as visual artists, we have almost zero audience. I mean, you compare like what the greatest visual artists, whoever you want to pick, Michelangelo, you know, any of the Renaissance artists or any like really well-known contemporary artists. I mean, compare their influence to Taylor Swift. So you gotta be realistic about it, and you know, and know that you're wasting time thinking about who you're influencing.
So one of the things that you said was that like we as people are so much more than our career, and that being said, like I think being an artist is so much more than a career, and it also influences like our worldview and perspective. So I think that my question is that like now that you are not actively taking pictures and working in photography, do you still view yourself as an artist, or do you not necessarily pay attention to things such as subjects and stars and light and things like that nowadays?
It's ironic for me to be sitting here. You know, I'm just not that important, and you know, we always want to make, you know, we always want to find a cult leader. so this is the visual arts cult.
But I guess just to follow up is are you still looking in the world as an artist and creative and thinking about those kind of things, or if you stopped taking pictures and therefore you're not looking at the world in like a creative perspective?
Oh, still thinking about it, obviously. I mean, you can't help but think about it. And then I stopped taking pictures, frees me from having to think about how to fit things into photography, you know, so I can think about these ideas in a more free way.
Okay, we'll have couple more questions, and then we'll.
I'm probably okay with that. Baldwin, I have what I guess is a technical question. I've learned many things here today, but one really interesting thing that you mentioned that I did not know was about the importance of the height of the camera in creating your art. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and just explain to us how the position of the camera in this piece affected this particular piece of art.
The reason why statues are mounted on pedestals is to make you look up. And when you look up, you're according importance to that person. And when you look down, you're not just looking down physically, you're also in some way diminishing or demeaning that person. So the height from which you see your subject is crucial. And it's no mistake that in the fields of like fashion photography, the favorite camera was held at waist level, at belly button level, to allow you to see the proportion of the body correctly, that it was not foreshortened in any way. So yes, point of view is, I think, the largest determining factor in the outcome of a photograph. So don't be afraid to squat down, and don't be afraid to get up on your tippy toes. You know, some of Ansel Adams's best landscape photographs were made by his standing with his camera on top of a custom-made platform on top of his car. He wanted to be higher. So even for a still life, it's an important consideration.
This is probably an inane question, but I need to know about the photograph with the woman sitting on the bed and the baby in the air. So was that manipulated, or was the baby really hanging, the child, in the air? If you can pull that one up. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I don't like that photograph. I don't like the situation from which it developed. I was chatting with this woman outside. She had her baby in her arms, and she invited me inside to take some more pictures. And then when she did this, I said, "Don't do that. I mean, that's dangerous." And she insisted. And so it's really more a picture I made for her than for myself.
I've been not asking this question for about 20 minutes because I don't think I want a picture ruined for me, but I'm not suggesting you're going to ruin it, but there's a picture in the show that asks more questions than it answers for me, and it makes it very powerful. And it's the one of the little child on the bed, and the bed's pushed up against a door, and there's almost nothing on the walls, but there are photographs. And at first I thought they were Polaroids, but then I really, really spent some time. I went back to this picture 3 times because they're square pictures, and some of them are not the same size. And that's not one of the ones that you have up there, unfortunately, so I can't point to it. But I was wondering, in that moment, I thought about the legacy of having studied with these great masters of the history of photography. They were all the students of history of photography as photographers. But I was wondering about those photographs, if you remember what they were, where they came from. They're so small in this big picture that I can't really make them out.
Those little pictures underscore how important photographs are to everybody. Throughout history, even during times of extreme depression and poverty, people would decorate their homes with photographs. People would put up calendars with pictures. There's something really important about seeing a depiction of another world. And in the picture of mine that you're talking about, there's evidence of that by those little pictures. But in the upper corner, and this is why that was a special picture for me, is a picture that I had taken of them and had sent back to them. So they put that picture of mine up on display. And so, it's really cool to show your work in a gallery and everything, but it was cooler to have this one family think about the experience of having their baby photographed.
Well, Andrew, Baldwin, thank you so much. If y'all have any individual questions for Baldwin, he'll be around, and we're going to also go into the atrium area. There's a table set up. If you'd like to purchase a book or have Baldwin sign it, he'll be available for that, or we can go into the galleries and look at the show again. Thanks, everybody, for coming.